It's my coach used to say it's go-to time. It's go time now.
Welcome to the 20th episode of the Kyle Olson Show. We're officially in the home stretch of the 2020 presidential campaign, and it's not coming a moment too soon. I don't know how much more I can take of Joe Biden. It's not that I just disagree with his opinions, because I do. It's that he just stands there and says things that completely contradict what he has said in the past, and not things from 20 years ago, but 3 weeks ago. It's one thing to evolve your positions and opinions based on new information. I don't have a problem with that. I've done that. I think everybody's done that. That's a mature, rational thing to do. Here is Joe Biden during the Democratic National Convention 3 weeks ago.
We'll have a national mandate to wear a mask, not as a burden, but as a patriotic duty to protect one another.
That was pretty clear, wasn't it? Here's a few days later.
It's about saving Americans' lives. So let's institute a mask mandate nationwide, starting immediately, and we will save lives.
Got it? Mask mandate nationwide. It doesn't get any more clear than that. Here's where things get wobbly.
But so you don't see, you had suggested there would be some kind of a federal mandate about masks. So now you're saying
here's what I suggested was I would ask every person in authority. There's a question whether or not a president under the Constitution could mandate everyone wear a mask. And remember, all during the primary, I'd have a lot of people telling me I would by executive order do. I'm a constitutionalist. You know, you can't do things the Constitution doesn't allow you the power to do.
Joe Biden's a constitutionalist. I bet you didn't know that, did you? It came as a surprise to me. Maybe he took Barack Obama's classes on the Constitution. Anyway, before I digress, now listen to this from earlier this week.
Well, I hope we can trust the governors, but here's the deal. The federal government, there's a constitutional issue whether the federal government could issue such a mandate. I don't think constitutionally they could. Well, I hope we can trust the governors, but here's the deal. He
went from definitively saying he wants a national mask mandate to I'm a constitutionalist and there's some constitutional questions about it to it's unconstitutional. Don't you think if you were a presidential candidate, especially one that's been in this business for over 20% of the life of this country, that you'd figure out if your proposal was constitutional and do that before you say anything publicly? Do you think the person who wrote this speech and fed it into the teleprompter saw the previous statements? Or maybe they thought nobody would care and the media, of course, wouldn't say anything. Need more? Here's Joe Biden on February 28th.
But I want to take a moment to say it's not a time to panic about coronavirus.
Here's a mashup put together by Tom Elliott from Grabien of Democrat politicians and their appointed officials back in February.
The risk to New Yorkers for coronavirus is low, and our city preparedness is high.
This should not stop you from going about your life, should not stop you from going to Chinatown and going out to eat. I'm going to do that today myself.
Come to Chinatown. Here we are. We're, again, careful, safe, and come join us.
There is no concern at this time for coronavirus in our region.
The Department of Sanitation is ready for Mardi Gras 2020.
The facts are reassuring.
We want New Yorkers to go about their daily lives.
But there's really no need to panic and to avoid activities that we always do as New Yorkers. We are a hardy people.
Americans do not need to panic. What I would suggest, however, is that Americans take this as a wake-up call for seasonal flu.
There's very little threat here. This disease, even if you were to get it, basically acts like a common cold or flu.
So we're telling New Yorkers, go about your lives, take the subway, go out, enjoy life, and certainly not to miss the parade next Sunday. I'm going to be there.
If you had to, would you close down the borders?
No.
We need to be honest about the American people, with the American people about the fact that we can't keep people coming here from China.
And transmission is not that easy. I think there's been a misperception that coronavirus hangs in the air waiting to catch you. No, it takes direct person-to-person contact.
We also know that if it were likely to be transmitted casually, we would be seeing a lot more cases.
Right, because this is New York and you're in elevators and trains with everybody all the time.
We know a lot of this information is incorrect now, but you know what? It was the information these people had at the time. They were learning and processing in real time. It was how they and we understood the virus. Frankly, I think we should cut them some slack for that. So a kerfuffle erupted on Wednesday when a clip of an interview President Trump gave to Bob Woodward on February 7th was released. In it, he essentially acknowledged that he was not going to say things that might create a panic. Interesting, Bob Woodward decides to release it after Labor Day, right before an election, and not say March, when it could have saved lives and altered our course. But that's what happens when you deal with people like Bob Woodward. Anyway, here was Joe Biden's response on Wednesday.
We just learned from the Washington Post columnist Bob Woodward that the President of the United States has admitted on tape in February he knew about COVID-19 that had passed through the air. He knew how deadly it was. It was much more deadly than the flu. He knew and purposely played it down. Worse, he lied to the American people. He knowingly and willingly lied about the threat it posed to the country for months. He had the information. He knew how dangerous it was. Now, while this deadly disease ripped through our nation, he failed to do his job on purpose.
Then, after all of this, all of these conversions, all of these transformations and gaslighting from Joe Biden, he has the audacity to tweet, quote, "You deserve a president who tells you the truth." Yes, we do. And you ain't it. Will Joe Biden hold Nancy Pelosi, who was in that mashup, to the same standard? What about Bill de Blasio, who was also there? What about his own advisor, Ron Klain, who was also in that mashup? No, he won't do that because it's just a desperate political attack. And the media will not hold him accountable. Here's another interesting story from this week. This is WZZM in Grand Rapids.
Your voice, your vote now. The most recent leader of the Republican Party in the state of Michigan says he's choosing the Democrat for president this year. Rick Snyder, just the latest high-profile member of the GOP to say he's voting for Joe Biden instead of President Trump.
This doesn't come as much of a surprise. Rick Snyder didn't like Trump in 2016. Rick Snyder was a John Kasich guy during the primary and was very vocal in the general election that he didn't like Trump. What makes it different this election is Rick Snyder is the guy Flint activists have accused of poisoning black people in the city when the emergency manager made the decision to change the water supply. Remember that? I thought it was an unfair attack at the time, but that was their position. Here was Michael Moore in 2016.
I think the people of Flint are ready to come out of their homes right now and go down there. They want their government back. They want their mayor back. They voted for these people, and they want this governor arrested. They want this governor prosecuted, and thank God the Obama administration now has got the U.S. District Attorney in Flint investigating what's going on, investigating the governor, and our hope is that this governor will be prosecuted for the reckless behavior and for knowing for a full year that this was toxic water.
So now the guy progressives hate so much has endorsed their candidate for president. What to do? What to do? Joe Biden's campaign is so tone-deaf to all of this, he has embraced the endorsement. They touted Rick Snyder's USA Today op-ed to reporters. They want the Rick Snyder endorsement because they think it will peel off Republicans in Michigan. Let me ask you a question. Did you like Rick Snyder? Did you like voting for Rick Snyder? Would Rick Snyder's endorsement sway you in an election? Joe Biden's campaign apparently thinks it will. But what they don't realize, which should be very telling about their tone deafness for how people really feel in Flint, is that Rick Snyder's endorsement should backfire on Biden. The Trump campaign should pump advertising into the Flint market with that endorsement because residents will turn against Biden. If Trump can flip Flint, he'll win Michigan. To me, it's really that simple. Some progressives get it. Michael Moore tweeted, quote, "The Biden campaign, in an effort to convince Flint voters to stay home on November 3rd and lose Michigan again, happily announced and embraced the endorsement of former Governor Rick Snyder, the man who poisoned Flint's water, 10,000 children with permanent brain damage, countless dead. Shame." Will the Snyder endorsement affect Joe Biden's standing in Michigan? We'll know in a few weeks. This is the Kyle Olson Show. Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. Joining me now is Alan Bakari, senior tech writer at Breitbart News. He's also author of the new book, Deleted, Big Tech's Battle to Erase the Trump Movement and Steal the Election. It's available for pre-order at all your favorite merchants. So, Alan, tell me how Big Tech is trying to erase the Trump movement.
Well, it's doing this in two important ways, and one of the ways is what we've seen, what many of your listeners will be familiar with, the bans and the deplatforming of many prominent Trump supporters, many grassroots Trump supporters over the past 4 years. But the more insidious thing they're doing is what you can't see, which is the changes they've made to their algorithms that determine what you see on your front page when you log into these platforms, or what you see at the top of your Google search results. They've made lots of changes to those over the past 4 years. And what my sources inside these companies have been telling me, it's quite terrifying what an algorithm can do. If you tell a computer algorithm that, ordinary conservative speech is hate speech and needs to be suppressed, what that can do is then suppress an entire movement at the same time, simultaneously. Because if an algorithm is scanning every post that everyone makes before it goes out and determining whether it will go, at the top of trending topics or at the top of your news feed or at the very, very bottom where no one will see it, then that's a formula for censoring entire movements at the same time, just based on how they talk and the references they use and the things they post.
So some people will allegedly violate a company's standards, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever it may be, which incidentally differ greatly from the First Amendment, and then they're just disappeared. Maybe one of the most extreme examples is Laura Loomer. But what remedy is there for when you just get deleted by one of these platforms?
Well, there isn't a remedy, and it's always been very bizarre to me that if you own a physical business in the real world, your landlord can't evict you for any reason or no reason. They'll have to follow a strict legal due process. You can even take them to court if you think they've evicted you for the wrong reasons. But if you own, if your business is dependent on one of these platforms, Facebook or YouTube, which many people's businesses, that is the case for many people these days, that their livelihood is tied to these online platforms, you have no recourse. And the reason you have no recourse is because Congress passed a law in the 1990s, essentially giving tech platforms wide leeway to remove anything they like for almost any reason. And tech platforms have used that law to argue in court that they can ban you for whatever reason they like, no matter what the impact is on your livelihood. And I think that's a point that goes even beyond politics, just to a simple question of business fairness and consumer protection. Because so much of our livelihood, so much of our business, so much of our day-to-day lives is now dependent on these platforms that can censor us, remove us, erase us from the internet for any reason they like.
I used to be one of those hands-off, let the market figure it out kinds of people. And that's still where largely I am when it comes to many other issues. But if you look at Facebook, Twitter, Google, and how they essentially operate like a totalitarian government, it just seems to me like something needs to be done about that. And regardless of what you think about these people that get wiped out, it's Alex Jones or it's Laura Loomer or all these, various other people, regardless of what you think about that, it seems to be like there's a very coordinated campaign going on between these companies. And it's like somebody that can get deplatformed by multiple companies within a matter of hours, as if it's some sort of a campaign. What is your take on that?
So this just shows me how power is shifting from the government to these unaccountable corporations. Because, the left knows they can't just go to the government and ask to censor someone. There's a First Amendment that stops the government from doing that. They can do that in Europe, and that is what they do in Europe. But in the US, it's different. They have to instead outsource censorship to these tech platforms. And we really have to ask ourselves, do we want free speech in reality, or do we want free speech just on paper? Because with so much communication now being controlled by these tech platforms, we won't really have a First Amendment in practice if we allow these companies to keep getting away with it. And I'll point out that they don't need to censor anyone. This is a choice that they're making. I've often made a point that if these tech platforms wanted to, all the content filters they've developed for, so-called hate speech, so-called fake news, whatever you can think of, they could simply be made opt-in filter buttons. that users could choose to switch on or off. Google has had an option called Safe Search. They've had it for many years, almost since they were created, that users can choose to turn on if they want to filter out obscene results. There's no reason why every other tech platform can't utilize similar technology. The reason they're not doing it is because they want that power to control the discourse. And really, political elites want them to have that power as well. They're very, very threatened by a genuinely free and open internet. Because in that short window when there was a free and open internet, say the early 2010s and the late 2000s, that was when all these populist movements emerged and proliferated. It created an environment where the elites couldn't predict where the next radical movement and when the next radical movement was going to emerge and threaten their power. That's why they had to kill internet freedom. And that's really what they've done over the past 4 or 5 years. All this amazing technology that allowed people to access the global audience immediately just by having a laptop or a smartphone connected to the internet. That's been taken away from everyone. And that's something I think should make every internet user, whether they're American or not, really, really angry, because this was a huge step forward for free speech, for the democratization of information, and elites have just completely taken that away from the people.
So when you say elites, do you mean the companies, the government, they're colluding together? What do you mean by that?
They're definitely colluding together. If you look at congressional hearings, you'll often see Democrat politicians pressuring these companies, why haven't you censored this person or that person? That's what they did with Alex Jones. You also see journalists, mainstream media organizations using their power to generate bad press about these companies as means to pressure them into censoring their competitors on the internet. You also see left-wing activists trying to whip up advertising boycotts against platforms like Facebook and YouTube when they don't censor enough. So even if these tech platforms didn't want to censor, which I believe they do want to censor, you'd have left-wing advocacy organizations using their power to pressure them to do so. That's why, in a sense, regulating these companies to say, well, look, you can't just censor First Amendment protected speech. You have to give users the option to filter what they want instead. That would actually, in a sense, help the tech companies. Then they could, there'd be no incentive for these left-wing advocacy organizations and these journalists and these politicians to constantly try and damage the tech companies, to force them into more and more censorship, because there'd be a law preventing the censorship. So it would really be helpful, not just for consumers, but for the tech companies themselves.
So what is the solution? What is it from the Congress? Is it from the executive branch? What's the solution?
Well, you really need multiple solutions to solve different problems. So to solve the problem of Google's search engine bias, that's something you really need, antitrust investigators to get involved with that. And that is what we're seeing. The Justice Department is looking at an antitrust investigation of Google. With the social media censorship, what I think you need to do two things. First, you need to give people the ability to sue these companies if their accounts have been wrongfully terminated, especially if it's impacted their livelihood. And the second thing you need to do is create an industry-wide standard where any filter on First Amendment protected speech that these companies want to implement is simply going to be an opt-in filter that users can decide whether to enable or disable, instead of having this top-down system where these companies decide what we can see and what we can't see. You've got to give it over to users and maximize user choice. I think that has to be the standard.
Alan Bakari, senior tech writer at Breitbart News and author of Deleted, Big Tech's Battle to Erase the Trump Movement and Steal the Election, is available September 22nd, but available for pre-order now wherever you buy your books. Alan, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Kyle.
This is the Kyle Olson Show. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. Dr. Simone Gold is a board-certified emergency physician for more than 20 years and a Stanford University-educated attorney. She's also founder of America's Frontline Doctors, a group opining that hydroxychloroquine is a remedy to the coronavirus. She joins me now. So you held a press conference outside the U.S. Supreme Court back in July. Tell me about what happened after that.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, it was really quite a to-do. I decided to do the White Coat Summit to bring together physicians and social media influencers so that we could educate the American people, because there's a lot of information people were not getting. So we actually did about 7 hours of educational videos, but in the middle we broke for lunch and we walked over to the Supreme Court and had a press conference. And, you heard the press conference, but of course I did not know that we were going to have such a reaction. I'm told there was almost 20 million views in 6 to 8 hours, and then we were deplatformed everywhere. And then everything kind of exploded.
So what was your experience being deplatformed after you're giving your medical opinion?
I knew that censorship existed in our country. I've seen it. I've directly witnessed it. I know that there's a lot of bias, but it was astonishing that all platforms simultaneously took us down. For one thing, they're supposed to be competitive with each other. There's YouTube, Facebook, Google, Instagram, and LinkedIn all took us down. Also, my own website, which was hosted on Squarespace, which is not a social media platform, also took us down. That means there's such a coordination of activities that I actually didn't know existed.
And so this is what I don't understand. You're a degreed, licensed medical professional giving your educated opinion. You're not somebody sitting in your basement spouting crazy theories into your webcam for 15 people, which, by the way, is allowed under the First Amendment. But your medical opinion is based on research, experience, and science. Other medical professionals may disagree with you, and that's okay as long as it's rooted in those same things. When did Twitter and Facebook become medical experts? Who made them the arbiters of what's disinformation about the coronavirus?
Right. So they've made themselves the arbiters. It turns out that 2 days after our press conference, there was a hearing in Congress on big tech censorship. It was coincidental. It had been postponed till that day. So Mark Zuckerberg was actually in Washington testifying, and he was asked many questions about why he himself, his company, took down our videos. So he answered on point. And he said that we were spreading disinformation. And I say back to him, what medical school did you go to? What residency did you participate in? And what patients have you treated? Because who are you to say what I can say about my own medical experience and knowledge?
So Facebook and I believe Twitter as well, they say that they're relying on the WHO for their medical information. And so if someone says something on their platform that is contrary to what the WHO says, then they, will delete that or they'll ban that person or whatever. Why is that significant?
Okay, let's just pause and let that register. That is so insane. I've heard them say that. When did we get to be the point that we are listening to the WHO as to what Americans can hear in their own nation? It's insane on its face. And by the way, not only is the WHO particularly corrupt, all right, they don't have a free speech clause or amendment like we do, but not only they're particularly corrupt, they've changed their mind over the periods. And when they change their mind, then YouTube and Facebook allows us to say that. That's insane. It's happened to us many times.
So you say the FCC should revoke Section 230 immunity for the social media companies. What exactly does that mean?
So when you publish, like Breitbart, for example, if you function as a publisher, you have to be careful that what you say is true or, hopefully close to the truth, or that you've done due diligence to discover if it's the truth. That's the job of the publisher. You can't just go out and publish something that's completely false and made up and defame somebody. It just can't do it. I'm sorry, you can do it, but you are liable to the person you've injured for money damages. The other option in life is to be a platform or just kind of a neutral conduit, like a highway or a freeway or a telephone company, and just transmit the information from place A to place B. You can be one or you can be the other. You're either responsible for the content or you're not responsible for the content. If you're responsible for the content, you owe damages if you injure someone. If you're not responsible, then you're simply a platform. The advantage to being a platform is you're not liable. So Google and YouTube have petitioned Congress to request that their status be platform. As a platform, they have a huge financial advantage over publishers. It's actually competitively unfair. It's unfair to Breitbart. It's also unfair to the New York Times, right? They need to pick a side. They need to either be the neutral platform like AT&T or like the highway, get you from point A to point B, or they need to be the publisher and be liable for the content. When they censor content, they have declared themselves to be publishers.
So then someone in your position who has been deplatformed by someone who's acting as a publisher, what can then your remedy be?
This is where it gets complicated. Our First Amendment rights apply to citizens against the government. The government has to allow us free speech. So the argument has been that private companies don't have to allow free speech. It's their own private business. To that, I say there's a complete monopoly on information. We've never had the situation in the history of the world where a few companies control all of the information in the world. That situation is inherently unstable, especially if you want to run a democracy. So essentially there is no way to have a democracy if the companies that are controlling speech are bigger than the government. So I think that the law needs to catch up with this, and the law needs to apply our First Amendment rights to entities even bigger than the government, such as the private platforms, or better yet, we need to break up the private platforms because they're too big. And it actually legally, I don't understand how they haven't been charged with antitrust violations. Antitrust violations kick in, I think, at around 20 or 25%. Don't quote me on that. But when you have 20 or 25% of market share, it's considered such an overwhelming advantage that it hinders competition. So it seems very obvious to me that these companies need to be broken up. And I really hope that we start working on that.
So do you think this is that reform? Is that a function of the Congress? Is that a function of the FCC, or both? How do you view that?
Well, first of all, we need to revoke Privilege 230, right? Because as soon as they have financial penalty for doing what they're doing, they might then change. But Congress needs to we need to break up the companies. They need to start competing with each other. If they start competing with each other, this ship will right itself.
But don't you think Facebook and Twitter would argue that they are competing with each other?
Oh, they're clearly not. And I think that's what my case is going to bring out. All of these companies deplatformed me within an hour. That could not have happened by accident. They obviously were communicating.
And you take the case of others who have been deplatformed. Laura Loomer is, I think, a good example, where, I mean, she has been deplatformed by her bank, which I didn't realize that that's even a thing. But you're right. I mean, you see these various individuals or organizations, and it's like within just a number of hours, they're just, deplatformed by a number of different companies. And you sort of sit back and you say, I mean, it just seems to me like there's some coordination. I don't know if it's the companies working together. I don't know if these various left-wing organizations that, want to shut people down, if they are doing some sort of activism campaign towards these companies all at the same time. I don't know what the issue is, but it just seems to me like there clearly is coordination going on. Do you think, though, that the Congress will get serious about this?
So there's a couple things I want to say before I get to Congress. I was stunned. There's obviously coordination. Everyone came down within about an hour. That cannot happen in a normal competitive environment. I also want to say that I forgot to mention that PayPal also held onto my funds for a long time. They eventually released them. But the reason I remembered it is because Candace Owens had done a GoFundMe. And they actually, I forgot who the company was. I don't want to say if it GoFundMe if it wasn't. But they wouldn't actually give her the money. So they were putting their own 2 cents. They're putting their finger on the scale. I believe that if we take the House, that we have a shot at breaking up big tech. I will tell you that when this happened to the doctors, even members of Congress were stunned. We met with many members of Congress that week, and they were really surprised. Many of them knew people who knew people who knew our doctors, or themselves had patients or family members that needed hydroxychloroquine who couldn't get hydroxychloroquine. Like, they knew we were very mainstream doctors talking mainstream medicine, and they couldn't believe the rapidity with which we were shut down. And I think the fact that they had a big tech censorship meeting in Congress that week really helped highlight it. I do think Congress will act on this, but they need to have a majority in the House.
Dr. Simone Gold, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
This is the Kyle Olson Show. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. Robert Joseph is Senior Scholar at the National Institute for Public Policy and Professor in the Graduate Department of Defense and Strategic Studies at Missouri State University. Ambassador Joseph was Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, and in the first term of George W. Bush, he served in the National Security Council as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Proliferation Strategy, Counterproliferation, and Homeland Defense. I wanted to have him on today to talk specifically about Iran. So, Ambassador Joseph, thank you for joining me today. So there was recently an intelligence statement asserting that China prefers Joe Biden to be elected president. Who do you believe the Iranian regime would like to see elected in November?
Well, I think the answer is very clear. I think the Iranian regime would prefer to deal with a Biden administration rather than with a Trump administration. The experiences are starkly different. The Trump administration has, for the past 3.5 years, under the policy of maximum pressure, been placing very punishing economic sanctions on the regime. It has supported our Gulf allies, a number of whom are targets of Iran. It has spoken out on the gross human rights violations of the regime. And it has been willing to stand up to Iranian provocations. I think that was most vividly demonstrated with the killing of Soleimani in January. By contrast, the Obama-Biden administration pursued a policy of appeasement in the hopes that the regime would become more moderate, a false hope that various administrations have chased for decades. If you look at the JCPOA, which was the Obama-Biden crown jewel in terms of their diplomatic efforts, the Iranian regime got everything it wanted. It got the right to enrich. It got the right to continue development and research on advanced capabilities, centrifuge capabilities, the ability to produce fissile material for nuclear weapons. It has received well over $150 billion in payments that have been used by the regime to support aggression in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and elsewhere in the region, and to subsidize its terrorist proxies like Hezbollah. The agreement also has sunset provisions, which are becoming very much aware to us now, as we see the actions at the UN. And these sunset provisions will allow Iran to be a threshold nuclear weapon state. And the Biden team today has made very clear its desire to resurrect the JCPOA, despite its many flaws. And it's my sense that they're willing to pay a very high price to do this, despite the fact that Iran is, according to the IAEA, in violation of the agreement. Just one violation is that it has accumulated 10 times the amount of low enriched uranium that it's permitted under the agreement, and that if further enriched would be more than enough for a nuclear weapon.
Amnesty International recently published a report detailing some of the brutal treatment of some 7,000 protesters who participated in the uprising last year. What was your reaction to that report?
Well, I think the report is a true indictment of the regime's brutal repression and its total disregard for human rights and the rule of law. I think it's important that we not see that report in isolation, because it is part of a much larger 40-year pattern of gross human rights violations. It's not just the documented torture of the protesters, as we see in this report, protesters who are doing nothing other than seeking a free and democratic Iran. The regime is at war with its own people. The people are the first and foremost victims of the religious dictatorship. And I think we're at a point where, and you saw this in November and you saw it again in January, the people of Iran have had enough of the brutality. They've had enough of the endemic corruption. They've had enough of the wasteful spending on foreign adventures. And as I said, support for terrorist proxies. The economy is now near bankruptcy. And the people know that the regime is at fault. It's the regime that has robbed the people of their prosperity and their livelihood. What we saw in the street demonstrations across Iran last November were calls to end the regime. And I think this is a fundamental point. It's no longer a case in which the people of Iran support the regime. They're now calling for an end to the regime. And over 1,500 protesters were murdered as they expressed their hope for a democratic Iran. As the Amnesty International report documents, many of those arrested have been tortured in the most barbaric ways. Those who have committed the atrocities must, in my view, be held responsible. It's also important to look, at the fall of other authoritarian regimes in the past, because what I think is important is you see a pattern here that's consistent with what we're seeing in Iran today. The regime is desperate. The regime is failing. It is on the wrong side of history. And I think it's imperative on us to support the democratic opposition inside and outside Iran, recognizing that it will be the people of Iran who determine their own future. What's most important and what's most disturbing, at least in my view, about the Biden position on this is that by re-engaging in negotiations and paying the regime to reconstruct the JCPOA, to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, the likelihood is that we'll throw this dying regime a lifeline. And that would be a fundamental strategic mistake.
Do you think the Iranian people who want democracy and they want freedom, do you think that they could see Joe Biden as an ally in that effort?
I don't think that they will, because I think that they will see a return to negotiations with this regime. And let's face it, a return to negotiations will be a return to the appeasement policy. And that will strengthen the regime. It will provide them with more resources. And these resources are used to put down the resistance within Iran. These are the resources that are used to not only arrest, but to torture those who are arrested, as we see in the Amnesty International report. The Iranian people aren't going to be fooled by a set of talking points to the contrary. They're going to know that there is a dramatic choice between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and that the interests of the people, not the regime, the interests of the people of Iran lie with the Trump policy as opposed to the Biden policy.
Iran is about twice the population of California. It's often difficult to get Americans to care about other countries, largely because I think, many people can't even find it on a map, thanks to our education system, but that's another story. But why should Americans care about freedom in Iran?
Well, I think freedom and the promotion of human rights has been a longstanding principle of American policy. It represents the values for which we stand. Iran is also, of course, very important in terms of geostrategic interests. And the Iranian regime, the dictatorship of the mullahs, have threatened U.S. interests in any number of ways. They have stated that they're willing to close the Straits of Hormuz, which of course would have a tremendous effect on the world energy picture. The regime has attacked our allies, including drone strikes on Saudi Arabia. The regime has conducted terrorist action after terrorist attack in Europe and elsewhere, even in the United States, where they were plotting to kill the Saudi ambassador. I attended a rally for Free Iran in July of 2018, and there was an attempt to bomb the rally, a peaceful rally with tens of thousands in attendance. The individual that was providing the bomb to the terrorists was an Iranian intelligence agent with diplomatic cover. He had a position at the embassy in Vienna. He's currently on trial for this terrorist activity. Long list of terrorist actions that have killed hundreds of Americans. We have to care about what happens in Iran.
Well, you're right, and that trial, I think, will be very telling, and it will be interesting to see if he's ultimately held accountable, and if the regime is ultimately held accountable. But unfortunately, we're out of time. Ambassador Robert Joseph, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you.
This is the Kyle Olson Show. For more of my work, go to Breitbart.com or find me on Twitter, Kyle Olson4. Use the same handle on Parler, Kyle Olson4, KYLEOLSON, and the number 4. Have a great rest of your weekend.